CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Naweed Jabbar-Gill.
And I'm Paul Barber. Our top stories: capping Russian oil prices. The G7's bid to stop Moscow profiting from the Ukraine war prompts worries over global supplies.
The trade row between the EU and US over green subsidies dominating the agenda at a high-level summit set to get underway now.
Russia unleashes a new barrage of missiles. Ukraine says Kherson has been hit 46 times in one day.
Back on track, more Chinese cities open up as COVID restrictions ease.
And will it be Japan or Croatia into the World Cup quarter-finals? We'll be live in Qatar.
A G7 price cap on Russian seaborne oil has kicked in, limiting the cost of a barrel to $60. The cap will also be enforced by the European Union and Australia.
In a joint statement, they said it will prevent Russia from profiting from the war in Ukraine, and it could make it difficult for Moscow to sell oil at a higher price.
Our correspondent Alex Cadier is in Brussels for us and following the story. Alex, this cap imposed after months of talks now, but Ukraine's president has already called it weak.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Volodymyr Zelensky calling it weak, his criticism, because that price cap is seen as too high. That is a view that was shared by some European member states and the leaders of those governments. Now, this is all part of the nature of the European Union. There has to be compromise. There has to be a middle ground solution found, and that $60 price cap is very much that. On the one hand, you had Malta, Greece and Cyprus who were worried about their shipping industries, and they were saying, well, actually, if that price cap is too low, then our economies will suffer. More hawkish countries like Poland and the Baltic states saying, well, no, let's really hit Russia where it hurts to go down to $30 a barrel. $60 is what we've landed for. The other thing happening in the European and kicking in today is a ban on the import of Russian crude oil. That's been agreed a little while ago now. Imports of crude oil banned entirely through shipping, not through pipelines, but that is still 90% of the imports of crude oil that the European Union was getting in from Russia. You may wonder, well, if you're not importing any crude oil, why are you capping the price? Well, a lot of those ships that I was talking about are insured in G7 countries. Well, that will mean they cannot be selling or transporting oil sold at more than $60 per barrel. Other ships have flags from European countries. They, again, can't be transporting that oil above the price cap. So there are a lot of ways in which the European Union and the G7 can impact the global market by bringing this price cap, which is very much designed to prevent, or at least to trim a little bit, Russia's ability to finance its invasion of Ukraine.
And looking at the war, France's President Emmanuel Macron, he's been under fire for suggesting that perhaps the West should be considering security guarantees for Russia.
Yeah, this was an interview given to the French broadcaster TF1, pre-recorded when he was in the United States visiting President Joe Biden on a state visit. Emmanuel Macron saying that the West should consider giving certain security assurances to the Kremlin, to Moscow, to not give up the impression that NATO is knocking at the door or very much close to the border or is a threat to Moscow and to Russia. Now, this goes against a lot of what NATO has been saying for months now, which is NATO does not seek conflict with Russia, NATO is not a threat to Russia, and NATO does not have particularly expansionist or imperialist tendencies when it comes to Russia and its territory. So President Macron is really shaping one vision, or at least what one vision might look like, of what the end of the invasion of Ukraine would look like, and that may mean security guarantees to Russia. That was the point made by President Macron. But allies, Western allies, the Baltic states, very critical, saying that he is playing into the Russian narrative that NATO is somehow responsible for this war. They're saying no, this was a unilateral act of aggression by Russia against Ukraine and should be treated as such. And the Ukrainians, even harsher in their criticism, saying security guarantees should be given to the world and not to Russia, to the world from Russia, calling Russia a terrorist killer state. So Emmanuel Macron under quite a lot of fire in what he's saying. Now, Joe Biden in that visit also saying at the same time that he would talk to Vladimir Putin if there is a will from the Russians to do that. So these are ongoing conversations, but Macron going a little bit too far there for some of his allies.
Thanks for that, Alex. That's our correspondent, Alex Cadier, in Brussels.
Well, the Kremlin has warned that the price cap will destabilise global energy markets, but won't affect Russia's ability to sustain the war in Ukraine. Live now to Moscow and our correspondent Stuart Smith. What else has Moscow been saying, Stuart?
Well, the first is that there will also, as well as be punishment in effect by preventing any country engaging in an oil price cap from receiving Russian oil, there will be further repercussions to come. Not yet specified by the Kremlin, but high-level officials here suggest they will come in the form of mirror measures, i.e. some kind of import from the European Union to Russia might be targeted. Now, it's not clear what that may be because there isn't much coming in anymore from the European Union, but perhaps from other G7 countries there could be a meaningful sanction placed that would cause some damage. But all of the states taking part in this oil price cap knew that the main consequence would be, as the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, warned many times, that they will no longer be able to get Russian oil if they've engaged in this price cap. The Kremlin said earlier today, it reminded the world that it believes this is a step that Western nations have taken that will destabilize the global oil markets. But indeed, for now, there hasn't been much of a problem, at least on the price of Urals oil, which comes from Russia. It's gone down in price, which is only what these nations intended when imposing the price cap. But again, it's not too far off what Russia is able to deliver, still with a healthy profit.
The Kremlin says it won't affect the war in Ukraine. What's its reasoning there?
Yeah, there's two reasons in effect. One is confidence that the economy in Russia has suffered the main blow it's going to experience, and the institutions here are very well set to deal with any further blows to come. That even if Russia starts to have problems financing its national payments, that there is enough wiggle room now in Russia to deal with any further problems economically, that the special military operation will take precedence in government funding and so will be funded by however much it needs to be. But the other confidence, the other degree of confidence comes from the fact that Russia doesn't believe it is locked in here. It has other markets it can sell its oil to, the caveat being that in order to do that, in order to avoid the price cap, it will have to use its own tankers or those of another state. It will have to use non-European Union insurers. 90% of the world's insurers were based in the European Union, so that's a tough ask. But if it can do that, it's confident that it will then be able to sell its oil as normal. The only difference being that the people buying Russia's oil, in the knowledge that such a price cap exists, will be able to bargain even harder for discounts on that oil. So Russia's still likely to make profits. It's not below what it costs to make and dig up the oil, but it is still likely to lessen the profits that Russia makes. But to what degree, it all depends on how well Russia can navigate this period of uncertainty. And analysts are expecting it'll be in the new year before we find out whether it's really working.
Stuart, many thanks for that update. Stuart Smith in Moscow.
Greek shipping companies, which have been transporting Russian fossil fuels, as we've been hearing, are warning that this price cap could further disrupt global oil markets.
Russia is the world's second biggest crude oil producer. Our correspondent, Evangelos Tsipsas, reports.
First, a ban on natural gas, then a partial ban on Russian oil, later a ban on providing insurance on tankers carrying Russian crude, and now a price cap on Russian seaborne oil.
This price cap has three objectives. First, it strengthens the effect of our sanction. Second, it will further diminish Russia's revenues. And thirdly, at the same time, it will stabilize global energy markets because it allows some Russian seaborne oil to be traded, brokered, transported by EU operators to third countries, as long as it is sold below the cap.
But while the price ceiling on Russian seaborne crude oil was welcomed by most EU countries, with some even asking for stricter measures, Malta, Cyprus and Greece, three coastal EU countries that play a significant role transporting Russian oil, warn of the wider economic consequences of clamping down on an industry critical to international trade.
Any sort of intervention in the liberal flow of commodities in the world affects the transporters. Certainly, the plafond that was set for the Russian oil will inevitably lead us to a price war of the different oil-producing countries.
Ships like the one behind me have been legally transporting Russian fossil fuels since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Many have voiced their concern that Greece has played a significant role in distributing Russian oil, therefore funding its war. Hence, this new measure. But analysts say although this price cap might have a short-term effect, the future for the shipping industry seems bright.
Certainly, the tanker market at this very moment is enjoying a balance in the equilibrium between supply and demand of tonnage, and hence this is more what they have in their mind rather than what is going to happen with the commodities and the prices at this very moment. The future for tanker market is seen very with great optimism, at least for the next few years.
This latest round of sanctions sends a strong signal that some of the world's richest nations are united against Russia's actions in Ukraine. But as the winter kicks in, Greece, with the world's largest tanker fleet, is taking a cautious approach by seeking alternatives to avoid the unintended consequence of further disrupting global chains. Evangelos Ipsos for CGTN, Athens.
Well, plenty happening then. Let's take a look at oil prices, and Brent crude is up around 0.5%. A short while ago, it was trading around $85 a barrel, having earlier seen a rise of nearly 3% and touching just under $90 a barrel. But it's still well below the high seen at the start of the Ukraine war. US crude is also up. Prices are rising not only on the OPEC decision and bets that Russia will not export oil subject to that price cap, but also the easing of COVID restrictions in China.
Other news now, and from Tuesday, people in Shanghai will no longer need to take a negative COVID test to enter most public places or take public transport. It's the latest major city to ease strict coronavirus measures. Beijing, Shenzhen and Zhengzhou have also scrapped the need for negative tests on public transport, while shopping malls and restaurants have reopened in many areas. Well, Guangzhou began relaxing its strict COVID measures last week, despite rising case numbers. Our correspondent, Cao Shufeng, has this report.
I live in Haizhou district, the hardest hit area of the ongoing outbreak. This street near my apartment is where I normally buy breakfast. And these shops were the first batch to be closed in response to the surge in COVID cases. But today, there is hope, as most of the shops have reopened with customers back to get their breakfast. Here is a bus station in Haizhou. Public transportation was temporarily suspended in many areas of the city. But right now, majority of subway and bus stations are in full operation, and passengers can get on board by simply presenting a green QR code. A standout feature of the city, the Guangzhou Bridge. It links Haizhou with Yuexiu district. Cross-district mobility was suspended for majority of Haizhou residents last month. Yet today, we are seeing lots of traffic. I work in this office building here. Previously, during each round of outbreaks, public places like this would require people to present a negative PCR test, which was done within 2 or 3 days when entering. But today, all I need is a green QR code like this. And perfect timing. Time to get back to work. Cao Chufeng, CGTN, Guangzhou.
Still to come on Global Business Europe. Tax credits for European electric vehicles are set to dominate trade talks between the EU and US. Will be live in New York and Brussels.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
way. This is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The World Today, every day on CGTN.
Roger, radio loud and clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we try to save the world.
Awesome! We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Hi there, welcome back. Remember, CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online, on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, we're available 24 hours a day on Freeview.
China's central bank has cut the amount of cash the country's banks must hold in reserve by 0.25%.
It's hoped the move will benefit private companies by releasing more cash for the banks to lend out. Our correspondent, Juju, reports.
The central bank said that it was estimated that the total long-term funds released from the reserve requirement ratio reduction is about 500 billion yuan, or over $70 billion. Experts said it will release sufficient liquidity into the market.
Various entities in the economy, such as small and medium-sized enterprises, would definitely benefit from such cut in ratio. At the same time, financial institutions will be in a better position to extend development assistance to the companies which require financial resources.
Factory activities of private companies shrank recently, largely due to COVID-19 flare-ups. A survey from the National Bureau of Statistics showed that companies of different sizes were impacted in November, as Purchasing Managers' Index, or PMI, tumbled from the previous month. There has been an increasing number of companies that saw a shortage of funds and insufficient market demand, while smaller businesses also face more acute operational pressure. The reserve requirement ratio cut is expected to help these companies solve their financial difficulties.
此次降总将会在一定程度上缓解民营企业融资难、融资贵的问题。
From the PMI data in November, you can tell that small and medium-sized enterprises face financing difficulties under conventional credit rules. Under the guidance policies, this comprehensive RRR reduction and the policy based on development financial instruments will enable some funds to flow into some key industries supported by the government.
定向流入一些国家重点扶持行业。
The latest PMI figures have reflected the challenge in the real economy. However, with the cut in RRR ratio, I think small and medium-sized companies would be in a better position to access various financial instruments to help them to operate their business and to overcome the difficulties presented in the real economy, in particular in the area of demand and supply side of the economy. With more policy coming out, it is more obvious that in the next few quarters, I think companies will be in a better position to access cheaper cost of capital, as well as will be in a more positive and supportive business environment.
Earlier last month, the State Council also proposed to increase support for private companies to issue bonds and apply more monetary policy tools to maintain reasonable and sufficient liquidity. Zhu, CGTN, Beijing.
The founder of the collapsed cryptocurrency exchange FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, has agreed to testify before the US Congress, but says he needs time to fully assess the facts. Writing on Twitter, he said he wasn't sure he will have finished learning and reviewing what happened by the hearing date of 13th of December. But once he had, he would testify. FTX filed bankruptcy in November.
Accountancy firm PricewaterhouseCoopers is to shut most of its UK offices for 11 days over Christmas to save on energy costs. The company's chairman told Britain's Sunday Telegraph newspaper that having offices open during the festive season didn't make sense. PwC has recently been offering flexible working arrangements to its staff, including allowing them to choose shift times.
The head of Vodafone, Nick Reed, will step down by the end of the year after failing to stem a fall in the company's share price. Reed was appointed chief executive in 2018. Vodafone shares have plunged by nearly half during his tenure. Chief Financial Officer Margherita Della Valle will be the interim CEO before a decision is made on a replacement. The company is planning major cost cuts and potential job losses.
New Zealand is set to introduce a law requiring big tech platforms to pay for news that they share. Under the proposals, online giants such as Facebook and Google will have to pay New Zealand media companies for local news that appears on their feeds. The legislation will be modelled on similar laws in Australia and Canada.
EU and US officials are meeting for trade talks with Washington's new climate law high on the agenda. The EU's concerned the $400 billion Inflation Reduction Act will damage European car makers by giving subsidies to American firms. Our correspondent John Terrett is following the story as in New York for us. Yes. John, just talk us through this act and why it's causing so much trouble.
Hey, Naweed. Hey, Paul. Well, quite simply, put simply, this is Joe Biden and the Democratic Party is a big piece of legislation. Now, he's actually got a lot more through than I think observers thought that he probably would, given the fact he doesn't really have a majority in the Senate or the House. He kind of does, but not a serious one. And he's got through the Infrastructure Act, he's got through the CHIPS Act, many other things as well. But this is really the big one, and it started out in life known as the BBB, the Build Back Better bill, and it was huge, $3.5 trillion worth of spending, massive social spending bill. But the trouble is the Democrats over the best part of the last year or so couldn't decide on how to spend it, where to spend it, whether it was inflationary, whether it wasn't inflationary. And in the end, it came down to the vote of pretty much just one senator in West Virginia. But they did get it through. They did get it through. However, it was a third of the size, less than a third of the size of what it was supposed to be. Not $3.5 trillion, but less than $1 trillion. However, they renamed it the Inflation Reduction Act. And it has within it the biggest single contribution, the biggest single spend by an American administration ever on the issue of climate change. And so for that reason, it's very historic. And for that reason, the Europeans pricked up their ears and paid attention. Now, the White House says that the almost $500 billion that is committed towards climate change issues in this bill is absolutely a central plank to President Joe Biden's Green New Deal. And they're very proud of it, and they don't want to tinker with it very much at all. Now, behind the scenes of this meeting, which is getting underway now in Maryland, and I think is going to last the best part of the rest of this week, behind the smiles, there is a lot of angst. Now, the Europeans are very concerned that this Inflation Reduction Act is actually going to hurt jobs within the Eurozone community. But on the other hand, the Americans say, well, we're not exactly happy with you either. Why is that? Well, that's because you're proposing tariffs and recriminations and restrictions on U.S. technology companies, including social media companies. So there's, a lot to discuss at this meeting, which is only just getting underway as we speak, pretty much. That is the rather uncomfortable background to what's happening in Maryland at the moment. Paul and Naweed.
And both sides have their concerns, as you've been touching on there. President Macron's fresh from his visit to the United States. Any indication that he attempted to raise the issue and change President Biden's mind?
Yeah, we are told so. We are told that he came with the express intention of doing just that. Now, he came because it was the first state visit of the Biden administration. And this is a very, very big deal. If a country gets a state visit, it means something. And you could see on their faces, the two presidents and the two wives were so happy to be together. They had a jolly good time, and the whole event went off pretty well. But we are told that Macron wanted to try and get Biden to alter some of the Inflation Reduction Act, and certainly to think about things regarding Eurozone economies when it comes to potential future legislation. Now, Macron wasn't just speaking for France, of course, he was speaking for the entire Eurozone and countries further in the region, because he says that they've been harder hit by Russian special operations in Ukraine than has the American economy. So we're told that Macron implored Biden to at least think and consider about Eurozone economies when it comes to this kind of economic decision-making. And the Europeans, I don't want to step on Rosie's toes because she's coming on in just a second, but in one sentence, they're very concerned in particular about subsidies for American-made electric vehicles and microchips. And basically the Europeans feel that jobs could go from the Eurozone economies and come over here. That's basically it. Macron said, why don't we work as closely on this issue as we do on the Ukrainian situation, trying to prevent Russia's special operation. Biden said, well, I'm not giving you an apology if that's what you want. I'm afraid we're rather proud of this. And actually, guys, he doesn't have to say anything. He really doesn't, because it is an American policy. However, Biden is a world player. He's made a big push in saying that America is back on the world stage. So what he did say was that there would be some concessions, some tweaks, as he put it, for unhappy allies. Trouble is, we don't know what those tweaks are. Nobody does, so we'll have to wait and see. Meantime, there is, as part of this meeting which is getting underway now, there's a joint task force, but the US Treasury holds sway over it. And the Europeans, I know, are very unhappy that a very limited amount of time, I think only about 60 minutes, has been put aside this week to discuss this issue. So it could be that we'll have some fine words from the Americans for the European delegation in Maryland, and that actually, in the end, very little will change.
John, thanks for that. That's our correspondent, John Terrett, in New York.
So let's now get the view from the other side of the Atlantic. Rosie Burchard is our correspondent in Brussels. So, Rosie, John touched on it there, but perhaps you could lay out for us just some of those main concerns that European leaders have about this.
Well, as John said, this is a piece of US legislation, but what the European Union is saying is that this legislation goes against the spirit of fair trade and potentially also the rules of fair trade. Now, what it comes down to is what it's known as Buy American provisions under the US Inflation Reduction Act. So that is essentially tax cuts for producers and manufacturers of green technology, particularly, for example, electric vehicles, but also the parts needed for this clean technology transition, like batteries. Now, under the Inflation Reduction Act, there are tax breaks offered to these industries, but they're specifically offered to American producers. And that is what is irking the European Union, because they say this is discriminatory and that it disadvantages European automakers like Renault or Volkswagen. And there is certainly fear here in Brussels among officials that this could, in the longer term, tempt European companies to up sticks and relocate production to the United States, which of course would have a knock-on impact on the economy here, particularly when it comes to jobs. Now, this meeting happening today in Maryland, the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, it was first set up as part of a sort of renaissance, a rebirth of friendly transatlantic ties under Joe Biden after some very rocky period under former US President Donald Trump. What we're seeing now is that due to this Inflation Reduction Act, and certainly due to the way it's being seen here in Europe, those ties across the Atlantic are once again being strained.
And so, Rosie, what kind of levers could the EU pull in response to this, certainly when it comes to their own fiscal firepower?
Well, that's exactly what EU officials are reflecting on as we speak. There are a couple of options on their table, a couple of tools potentially up their sleeve. Those include retaliatory subsidies here within the European Union, but they could also, for example, have a total rethink of the structure and the system under which European governments offer state aid, so subsidies to certain industries. Beyond that, this could escalate to some sort of a complaint at the World Trade Organization, but European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was speaking on Sunday, and she made it very clear that while the EU will respond, she says, in a well-calibrated way, she said it was not in the interest of the European Union nor the United States to have a transatlantic trade war just while there is an actual war being waged on the European continent. So they will continue work, both sides, in this task force which has been set up to try and resolve some of these issues. What the European Union would like specifically is a derogation which is already offered within this legislation to Mexico and to Canada. Very unclear whether that will be the outcome that they actually manage to get from these talks, which, as John pointed out, are certainly, in the view of some European officials, are not dedicating enough time to what is certainly the top and most difficult issue in Brussels' perspective.
OK, Rosie Birchard in Brussels, thank you very much.
Well, as Rosie and John were just reporting, Europe's car makers in particular are concerned that Washington's Inflation Reduction Act will severely damage exports to the United States as they try to recover from the pandemic and supply chain issues. Our correspondent Mark Webster has more from Paris.
French motor manufacturers like Renault were already experiencing huge challenges with falling sales, rising prices and a shortage of key components like microchips. The fear within the industry is that moves by the United States government to subsidise American-made cars will make life even more difficult. President Macron has taken a close personal interest in the development of electric cars in France. During his state visit, officials say he made clear to his American opposite number that the new legislation could do severe and lasting damage to European industry. That would leave European vehicle makers struggling to compete against new global competitors.
5 years ago, 1% of the sales market was electric. Today, it is 10%. We have multiplied by 10 in 5 years. The objective is that by the end of this 5-year term, we will be looking much further ahead, fortunately, and that's very good. We should have 30% of the sales market, but we are also trying to reduce emissions.
The automotive industry has been a key part of the French economy since the Second World War, and recently output peaked at 2.2 million vehicles a year. But a combination of economic downturn and the coronavirus pandemic saw production down by nearly 1/3, and it's only slowly recovering.
If people are absolutely aware of the fact that we are producing, that we have good cars and sustainable cars, more and more sustainable cars produced in Europe, then customers will also appreciate that. Yeah, that's absolutely also a quality aspect in that important market.
What has made life even more difficult is the disruption to the supply chain during the pandemic, which has led to a shortage of raw materials, parts and particularly intense global competition for the manufacture of microchips, which are crucial to modern vehicles. According to the latest figures, France still managed to produce nearly 1.7 million vehicles last year, of which 174,000 were electric. That at least has helped to support the 100,000 jobs in the car industry at a time of growing social unrest in France.
Clearly these issues also affect other European vehicle manufacturers, especially those in Germany and Spain, which have substantial exposure to the United States. And while President Macron did get some comfort from President Biden, it remains to be seen how far Washington is prepared to go when it comes to amending this legislation. At the same time, other global vehicle players want to expand their market share, which means that the pressure on Europe will by no means relent, particularly in the essential electric sector. Mark Webster, CGTN, Paris.
Still ahead here on the programme, the spectre of stagflation, why British businesses are warning of a lost decade ahead.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, in the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story, wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Louis Jabarkil and Paul Barber. The headlines again. Capping Russian oil prices. The G7's bid to stop Moscow profiting from the Ukraine conflict prompts worries over global supplies.
The trade row between the EU and US over green subsidies that's dominating the agenda at a high-level summit underway now.
And back on track, more Chinese cities open up as COVID restrictions ease.
With an economy that's shrinking and rising prices, the UK is facing a lost decade. That's the forecast from the Confederation of British Industry. It estimates the economy will contract by 0.4% next year, a sharp fall from its previous forecast in June. To discuss this, we're joined by Vicky Price, now Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research here in London. Thanks for coming back on, Vicky. Let's start with this grim warning then, another one for the UK economy. What will it mean, do you think, for businesses and workers?
Well, absolutely. And what we've been hearing from the CBI is not new, except that they have downgraded their forecast for next year quite substantially from 1% growth to a drop now of 0.4%. So quite a revision, but it follows very much what others have been doing, whether you look at the Bank of England or whether you look at the Office of Budget Responsibility, which accompanied the autumn statement of November with an analysis of both the fiscal and the economic side. So all forecasts have been downgraded significantly. The interesting thing about the CBI is that it has been warning about investment in particular for quite some time. It did so in the summer as well. It did so around the previous mini budget of September the 23rd. So it is a consistent message about which I think they're quite right, which is that it's low growth which is going to be a problem because we're not investing sufficiently in areas such as skills and innovation, and investment is low in this country. And that's basically their message. It is, we need to do something about this, otherwise we are indeed going to be stuck in a very long period of low growth.
And business investment exacerbated in recent years. We're still expecting it to be 10% lower than before the pandemic. Why is that, and what can the UK do to turn that around, do you think?
Well, it's interesting about investment itself because it's been pretty low in terms of the pace of growth at any rate since the financial crisis started, and then through the period of austerity, of course. And then we had Brexit, and the vote for Brexit didn't help, particularly in terms of anyone looking at the UK and the prospects they thought that the economy had for the future. So investment, in a way, sort of suffered as a result of that. And what we've seen is that in the last couple of years, of course, it's all been confused a little bit with COVID, but there is no doubt that investment is just not going to be coming back to the levels that we would like to see it, and therefore this decline that we've seen will mean that in a few years' time we will be still below, a long way below where we were pre-pandemic, and that's bad for productivity and bad for growth. And I think what the CBI is saying is that there are special allowances that the government has already put in place to encourage investment, but those allowances are meant to run out next year. What they want is those allowances, capital allowances, to be made permanent so that there is a serious incentive for investing by UK companies, and that will partly solve the problem in their view.
And you mentioned the Bank of England and the OBR, the fiscal forecaster. They suggest things will get even worse, the BOE predicting a fall of 1.5% next year. What's changed in recent weeks? Rishi Sunak's government in power now promising to turn this around. Can it be turned around by government policy?
What we have seen is that interest rates have been coming down a little bit on the long end of the yield curve. So in other words, long-term bonds, where the yields had gone up very significantly after the mini-budget of September the 23rd. The reversal that happened to most of the policies in that budget have meant that capital markets have become considerably more, they're taking comfort, if you like, from what is happening right now in the economy. They think it's a period of stability perhaps is coming, and maybe that is why they have improved their forecast. But actually, when you look at the underlying trends, there is absolutely no doubt that real incomes are being squeezed very significantly, that in fact, if you look at intentions, investment is quite low, and if you also look at employment intentions, they're also beginning to drop. So I think actually the CPI is probably too optimistic by comparison to the others.
Thanks for that, Vicky. That's Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research in London, Vicky Price.
Thank you.
Ukrainian officials say at least 2 people have been killed and several injured in a Russian missile strike in Zaporizhia.
It comes as Ukraine reports a barrage of new Russian missiles throughout the day, with air raid alerts in many parts of the country. The governor in Kherson says the region has been shelled 46 times over the past 24 hours.
Our correspondent Shamim Chowdhury is in the capital, Kiev. What's the latest there?
Well, authorities here in Kyiv are saying that at least 10 Russian missiles were heading in this direction, 9 of which were deflected by US-provided surface-to-air defense systems. And that number seems to be around the same in a number of regions and cities across the country, including Odessa, Lviv, Vinnytsia, Kryvyi Rih and Sumy. And just yesterday, the Ukrainian army had suggested that with the information that they had been given by their intelligence services, that around 100 or so missiles would be fired. It seems as though that number is quite close, although we don't have official figures for it yet. Now, as you mentioned, there have been 2 fatalities. That was in Zaporizhia, one of the regions that was hit by these missiles, and at least 3 injured, among them a 1-year-old child. We understand this is coming from authorities in Zaporizhia. We are also being told by the Ukrainian Navy that a lot of these missiles were fired from the Black Sea, which lies just south of Ukraine. And that is the reason why the city of Odessa has been hit particularly badly. At the moment, it doesn't have any electricity or water. Just to put this into context, these strikes have been targeting the electric grid, power plants, since the 10th of October. And it's been happening intermittently, periodically. The last time was around about a week ago. Before that, it was the 15th of November. That was a huge, huge strike, the largest so far, and it left at least a third of the country without electricity. This is happening at a time when it's very, very cold here. It's -6 degrees Celsius at the moment here in Kyiv. So leaving a third of the country without electricity or heating at any given moment is considered by Ukraine to be collective punishment. They've even gone so far as to describe it as a war crime. The Russians have actually admitted that they are hitting electricity systems and power plants, but they are saying that their aim is not to target civilians, but to damage the Ukrainians' centre of their military command.
Shamim, what can you tell us about these reports from Kherson, which we understand has been hit 46 times in the past 24 hours?
That's right. That's coming from the Southern Command, and it's actually not just today. This has been going on since Kherson was taken back by the Ukrainians on the 11th of November, about 3 weeks ago. The Russians then redeployed themselves, repositioned themselves on the east of the river Dnipro. Kherson city itself lies on the banks of the west of the Dnipro. Kherson is a province that straddles both the east and the west. Now, the west is under the control of the Ukrainians. The east is under the control of the Russians. Now, the Russian military are telling us that it's a bit of a mixed bag as far as the Russians are concerned on the east. They have at the same time as kind of retreating from certain settlements and small villages, they are also tightening up their positions in other parts of the region, and it is from there that they are firing. Why are they doing this? Well, it's to prevent the Ukrainian military from crossing over the river Dnipro and reaching them. The military has already had small battalions out on this very thin strip of Kherson from which it wishes to get to the Russians, and that is why the Russians are continuously firing into Kherson city. There's another flashpoint that I really want to mention very quickly, because it's the real kind of hotspot in terms of the fighting at the moment, and that is the town of Bakhmut in Donetsk. It's north of Kherson city. We are told, we spoke to a soldier fighting on the Ukrainian side just a few days ago, and he's on the front line, and he told us that the Russians are about 3 kilometers away from the city centre. They have encircled it, and there are some very, very heavy battles going on there. At this moment in time, the Ukrainians are managing to push them away, but yesterday the Ukrainians suffered very, very heavy losses, among them five Georgian soldiers from a voluntary battalion. Now, our sources there have told us that they still feel confident that the Ukrainians will be able to push the Russians away, but nonetheless, very heavy fighting in Bakhmut and other parts of the east and the south that have been going on for quite some time now.
Yes, a lot of moving parts there. Shamim, thank you very much indeed for that update. Shamim Chowdhury reporting live from Kiev.
South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa is challenging in court a report by experts which said he may have broken the law. Ramaphosa is facing calls to resign after allegedly concealing the theft of $4 million in cash from his farm in 2020. The Executive Committee of the governing African National Congress is discussing the issue a day after a smaller group of leaders failed to reach a decision on the president's future.
The biggest trial in Belgium's history is underway of 10 men accused of helping to plan the 2016 Brussels terror attacks. 32 people died when suicide bombers set off 2 devices at Brussels airport, while another exploded at a metro station. 6 of the accused have already been convicted over previous attacks in Paris.
Chinese President Xi Jinping and other senior officials have bid farewell to the country's former leader, Jiang Zemin, who passed away last Wednesday at the age of 96. Quan Chen reports.
In the Chinese PLA General Hospital, the room of farewell was filled with sorrow. Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, paid his solemn respects to former leader Jiang Zemin. He was joined by other leaders of the party and the state, including Li Keqiang, Li Zhanshu, and Wang Yang. They visited Jiang Zemin in hospital when he was critically ill, or sent condolences to his relatives after his passing. After paying their respects, they escorted his body to Babaoshan Revolutionary Cemetery in western Beijing for cremation. Along the way, the streets were full of crowds of local residents from all walks of life, paying their respect for the former leader. World leaders continue to pay tribute to Jiang Zemin during visits to Chinese embassies. The president and prime minister of Laos say the late Chinese leader played an important role in the development of bilateral ties. Leaders of Mauritius, Grenada, Nicaragua, and Dominica also visited Chinese embassies in their nations to send condolences. And over the past few days, diplomats from more than 120 nations have visited the Chinese Foreign Ministry in Beijing to offer condolences. Many spoke highly of Jiang's role in boosting China's ties with the nations. A memorial ceremony will be held at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing on Tuesday. People across China will pay a 3-minute silent tribute. The national flag will be flown at half-mast, and public entertainment activities will be suspended. Under Jiang's leadership, China experienced major economic growth and the return of Hong Kong and Macau. Chen Chen, CGTN.
Still to come here on CGTN. A place in the World Cup quarter-finals is up for grabs, but will it go to Japan or Croatia? We'll be live in Qatar.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back. US President Joe Biden's administration is considering making it harder for migrants to claim asylum at the US-Mexico border when current restrictions come to an end in a few weeks.
Excuse me, but some say the proposed policies are similar to those of former President Donald Trump, measures which were criticised by some Democrats, as Nick Harper reports.
A migrant camp on the Mexican side of the US border. Many of these people have travelled hundreds of miles through South and Central America in the hope of entering the United States.
The authorities ask us to clear the camp and to move to a shelter as colder weather is coming, but we don't want to leave because we think that here, before this wall, we're putting pressure on the U.S. people so that they let us get in.
At the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. enacted strict border policies known as Title 42. Those allowed authorities to prevent migrants from entering the U.S. or to expel them back to Mexico.
We tell the government to have a conscience, that it is not for fun that we migrate, but that we migrate to work for our children and our families.
But a judge has now ruled Title 42 unlawful and ordered that it ends midnight on December the 21st. When those restrictions end, the Biden administration expects migrant crossings into the U.S. to double. To counter that, the White House is considering a measure that would bar migrants from applying for U.S. asylum if they have not filed similar applications in other countries that they've passed through on their way to the border. The Department of Homeland Security says no such decisions have been made, but the White House admits it is weighing up several options.
So we've been preparing for this. We've been working to accelerate asylum process. Times to those without a legal basis to remain can be removed promptly. And we've set up anti-smuggling operations with Mexico and Guatemala, as I mentioned, as we prepare to transition to the next phase of our work to manage the border in a safe, orderly, and humane way.
The asylum restrictions could be similar to the Trump administration's 2019 transit ban, a policy that was ultimately struck down in federal court. If the Biden administration goes ahead with the restrictions, rights groups, including the American Civil Liberties Union, have warned they will sue the government over the plan's legality. Nick Harper, CGTN, Washington.
Japan are playing Croatia in the World Cup last 16, while Brazil, the tournament favourites, face South Korea later. The Netherlands, Argentina, France and England have already made it through to the quarter-finals.
Japan pulled off two big upsets in the group stage, beating Spain and Germany, and another win today will see them reach the last 8 for the first time in their history.
Let's join our correspondent Dan Williams in Doha. Dan, what's the latest from that match between Japan and Croatia? Fairly tense, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. Heading into extra time now, 1-1 the score. If you want to use a cliche of game of two halves, this could be it, because Japan were all over this game in the first half, scoring through Daisen Maeda, the Celtic player, after 43 minutes. But then Croatia have really come back into it in the second half and looked very much more dominant. Ivan Perisic scoring his 10th tournament goal on 55 minutes, and that's how it has stayed as we head into extra time for the first time in this tournament. Haven't had that yet. Potential of penalties, of course, as well. And as you say, Japan looking to reach the quarterfinals for the first time ever.
And then the other game, Brazil and South Korea. Brazil, they're the tournament favourites, and they'll be boosted by the return of their talisman, Neymar.
That's right, yeah. Brazil odds-on favourites to win this match, as you can imagine. The two sides actually met earlier in the year in Seoul in June, and Brazil winning that one 5-1. So odds heavily favouring Brazil, with or without Neymar. Of course, Brazil, if they did last time round, they did lose 1-0 to Cameroon, but it was a much changed side for Brazil, and it would be a huge shock, with or without Neymar, if South Korea were to pull off a shock victory. Now, Neymar, of course, he picked up an ankle injury in the first game. He missed the next two. We should find out shortly whether he's fit to return or whether he's at least fit to start in this match. Of course, South Korea come in after the back of a 2-1 win over Portugal. They are going to be growing in confidence, and their coach, Paulo Bento, he says that he's preparing his side to face Brazil, whether they have Neymar or not. Take a listen. This is what he had to say.
We'd be hypocrites if we said we'd rather play Brazil with Neymar than without Neymar. It wouldn't be truthful. I always want to have my players available, and if they're not, it's never a good thing. Neymar is well enough to play, but we don't know if Brazil will start him. But we're going to try and play the best game we can to compete against a great team that's full of talent.
Well, we haven't had much in the way of shocks, have we, in the last 16? It's been a World Cup of shocks, except until we get to the knockout rounds. And the likes of, so far, the likes of Netherlands, France, England and Argentina all going through. We could potentially have one, though, today, with Japan holding Croatia. Of course, they beat both Spain and Germany earlier. And then, of course, it would be one real shock as well if South Korea can pull off an incredible victory over Brazil, but so far very much going to form in the last 16.
Yeah, and it'll be a huge boost for Asian football as well. Dan Williams for us live in Doha. Thanks.
Desiree Bollier is the chair of Value Retail, a UK firm that owns 11 shopping villages worldwide. They include Bicester near Oxford, La Vallée near Paris, and the company's two newest outlets in China.
Despite having a law degree, Bollier was desperate to begin a career in fashion and has been telling Global Business why that meant dressing something other than people.
I was dying to be in fashion, didn't know where to start. From law school to being a window girl at Ann Taylor in Faneuil Hall in the 90s. So here we are, actually in the 80s, believe it or not. That should reveal my age, and I don't want that. No, I'm only kidding. So being a window girl, that was my first job at $4.50 an hour. Ego is a good thing, actually, because it helps establish you as a leader and who you are, as long as it's not servicing only you, but servicing actually all the others at the same time.
For more, check out CGTN's social media accounts and search for My First Job.
And that is it for Global Business Europe. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you. More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
See you again tomorrow, same place, same time, from all of the team here in London. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.